All right, so now that we've talked about texturing, the next thing that I moved on to was really to finalize the environment effects as far as fog, and also to sort of finalize lighting and composition. So right now we're at, let's go inside here. We're at 22. So this is sort of the save point where I've textured things. And we can see it goes up to 27. Yeah. So basically, from 22 to 27, in there you can see I worked on the locusts that fly around. Worked a bit on fog, z-depth for passes and for compositing. And so moving forward, really the thing to do is let's jump back to Photoshop. And so this is the last render that we looked at, where I had textured things, but there's still a bit of a difference between this and the final. And just, why don't we open the final just so that's clearer. Dun, 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 dun. Actually, I'll do it this way. There we go. Okay. So this is the final, and this is where we're at. So you can see at some point the background flips horizontally, and you can see that lighting on the character changes. We can see the sky changes color, and then I add all these effects into it. So the next render that I have in here is 23. And so you can see to the next Maya scene, because I fortunately save my test renders based on the name of the scene file. So I can see that from 22 to 23 there's a bit of a change, but what we're seeing in here isn't necessarily from Maya, meaning that I played around in Photoshop a bit to try and get some ideas of what directions things could go in. And a lot of that is just based on creating, if we go under here, adjustment layers. So things like brightness, levels, curves, just to see what I might like. Because what we can see in, this image versus this one is really a big change in contrast, and also deciding that the sky is going to need to change color. And so if we look at this Photoshop file, if I go in and get rid of those color correction nodes and get rid of a lot of, just let's say we turn just about everything off inside here that I can, then in the end the difference between 22 and 23 you can see is negligible. It's basically the same thing. So especially if I would turn off in 22, it probably has, it has a curves adjustment layer in here. So you can see they're basically the same, not much has changed. So what did I do inside here? Well, often it's faster to use Photoshop to do paint overs to figure out the direction that you could go with something. And so basically what's going on inside here is we can see that for the sky in the background, this one is just implying maybe I need a little bit of fog. So that's telling me, the Photoshop file becomes instructions for what I need to do in Maya. I added a photo filter adjustment layer on the sky, just in the end deciding I preferred the look of it being orangey, because blue was just too normal and happy, and so making the image a little more hellish, obviously. Getting a red sky would make more sense. This here is just me blurring the background a little bit. So telling myself, let's zoom in a little bit to that. You can see that this layer I just blurred the background. And so this is just me thinking I'm going to end up needing a little bit of depth of field. Here, this layer is an overlay layer where you can see I'm making everything a little bit more orange, making things warmer. This layer is just an overlay layer that's brightening up the interior, but I ended up having that off. A little bit of smoke in the scene, so telling myself that I'm going to need some effects in here to make it more interesting. And that's just an HSV node on that smoke, just to make it warmer. A little bit of smoke on the left, again with an HSV node to warm it up. Here I'm brightening up the lighting in those pits because I felt that the separation between this ridge of rocks and the pit and the rocks behind it wasn't reading very well. And so brightening that up by maybe adding some fog or smoke or something coming out of there was going to be helpful. Here, this is just me making a paint layer, just saying maybe there's some wispy fog inside here. That's what this is as well. And then 3 color correction layers, or adjustment layers. One that's adjusting HSV of the overall image. One that's applying a curves node to increase contrast. And an exposure node to also increase contrast. And then a brightness contrast node on top of everything to just boost things up. And so the difference between 22 and 23 isn't so much the scene file. It's really just the fact that I've done a lot of work in Photoshop. And then, you know, between this image and this image, I think this one just looks a little bit cooler. Just by having the increase of contrast, it makes it feel a little bit more photographic. And a little bit darker. But there was still a little bit of work to do in it. And so as far as PSDs go, and experimenting with that, so we're looking at 23 right now. So we're looking at this one. And then at this point, I can tell here that this is rendered at 3K. So even though these are test renders, I'm still rendering them kind of big so I can really evaluate the detail in the image, because I know that in the end, if I'm going to do a big render for the animation or for a still, I need to start evaluating things a little larger. And, you know, as days are going by, it's not a big deal to, you know, launch a render before I go to bed. That's high res, and then comp it in the morning. So, but this one, the fact that at 23, I decided to jump up with a PSD at 6K meant that I was potentially feeling that maybe I'm getting close to being done with the image. And so this just means I rendered out, you know, the background and the character a little bit larger. And let's open that up. Because since I knew that 6K was going to, by this point, I knew that 6K was going to be my target output. I knew that this was basically my aspect ratio, and that this was the aspect ratio for both a 30-inch display, and then that would be my target for the animation, and then my rendered print would be at the same size. And so this is now big, so we can see 6,000 by 3750, and it's basically the same as 22. So if we look for changes, though, we'll see that the scythe looks a little bit less blue. I've increased even further the contrast in the fog that's coming up from that pit. And other than that, that's about it. So let's take a look at this for a second. So it's pretty much the same PSD, just scaled up, because I can take a 3K PSD, resize it to 6K, and all of the, you know, color correction nodes are going to work just as well. I just need to swap out layers for the character and the background with higher res versions. And so inside here, if I zoom in all the way up to 100%, we can see that it is a pretty big render, and most of my things inside here are holding up. A couple things are maybe getting a little bit pixelated, but that's at 100%. Really, the way to look at renders is that at 50% is what they truly are if you were going to print it out based on 150 dpi. And yet, see, at this point, things look clean and not really pixelated. So what am I doing inside this file? Let's just sort of take a look. So the textures on the character and the shader are basically the same. I have at this point brought in some little bones and stuff into the scene. I can talk about that later, not a big deal. I just grabbed a skeleton and broke it up into a bunch of pieces and scattered them all over the place. And I did more of that after 23. But this layer right here is kind of important, layer 19, because that's the one you can see is taking the render with, a bunch of color correction nodes on it and really boosting the fog that's coming from those while also getting it to rise higher, meaning this is fog. And for something like that, a localized fog effect that's not in the entire environment, to do that in 3D, I use something called volume primitives in Maya that are super, super useful. And so this layer right there, layer 19, looks like this. And so, meaning this is actually rendered from Maya. This is a volume primitive test render that I did with a little bit of, let's say, like a fractal or a 3D texture mapped to the density of the volume primitive, and then rendering it out with a matte. So just putting a black hole shader on the ground so it blocks the fog. And in this scene, we can see that I have that set to linear dodge add at 60% opacity. So basically, I'm sort of testing some fog effects that I can do in Maya and then bringing them into my comp in Photoshop to see how they work. So there comes a point where I sort of just split what I expect to get out of a render in Maya and what I expect to have to composite. So something like fog effects, I don't render with my scene. I'll render the background and render the character separately. And then I'll render things like fog passes, effects passes like particles or whatever. And then things like a z-depth pass for depth of field as separate passes so that in my composite, whether it's in After Effects for the animation or in Photoshop for the still, I can get those together. And so I'm just kind of testing things out. We can see I still have some warm fog in here that's warming the top of the image. Here I've taken the background and flattened it, like all of this stuff, and added a little bit of depth of field to it. Although that was without that volume primitive fog in there, just to see what depth of field is doing to the image. So just giving it a little bit more depth. We can see I have some little, let's say, what is that? That's this layer, layer 18. That's just me going and starting to think maybe I could have some bugs flying around in the scene. So this is probably about the time that that popped into my head. And so this is just a layer. And so we can see with that, I think what I did is I actually did a Google search for a picture of locusts and then just separated it from the sky and comped it inside here on a layer. And so my lighting and texturing in the scene has not changed. I'm just further exploring in Photoshop. So really the only thing that I was doing in the scene in 23 was sort of messing around a little bit with volume primitives. So if we go into Maya, let's open 23. Test lighting 23. And let's get everything on. So my fog, area lights, left wall, the bones that I scattered around, some point lights, the ground, the right wall. I'm looking for from another camera. Let's look inside here. My lighting in the scene is still pretty much the same. Got some point lights next to the character. And you can see I have a volume primitive folder. That's what I was looking for. And with that, they're all hidden. Let me make them visible. Okay. And these are the volume primitives. So I have one big one in the scene. And then I have these smaller ones, which aren't really highlighting very well, but there they are. So Doesn't want to highlight normally when I select them this way, but either way, you can see these are volume primitives. And so they're created by going to create volume primitives, sphere, cube, or cone. So those are obviously cubes. And I'm not going to do a whole volume primitive lecture as far as how they work. That's something that would need to be for another lesson or tutorial. But basically, if you create a volume primitive, you get a shape, and when you render, it renders as if the shape is full of fog. And it creates a material in Hypershade that's assigned to it with a bunch of attributes. And the thing that's useful about them is that you can texture their color or their density with solid or 3D projected textures, which is why I have all these projection nodes in here. And then with these, we'll see that, or just a tip to give you, is that if you want these to render so that they're volumetric, meaning that they are truly 3D, you could fly through them or whatever, in the render stats, just by default this is off, turn on volume samples override and increase the samples to at least 10. For final renders, usually I use somewhere between 20 and 40, depending on if I'm going to fly through it or not. For a scene like this where I'm not flying through it, a value like 20 is okay. And this is what will get them to render like 3D volumes, which is really, really cool. And so basically these things that I have right here are what we're seeing in Photoshop on this layer. That right there. And so I can texture map in Maya their color based on height, so they're orangey at the bottom and red at the top. I can map their density. So if we go into Hypershade in Maya, and let me just select material from object and go inside here. There's one of my volume primitive nodes. And we can see inside here that I have mapped a solid fractal, some volume noise, a ramp with some noise onto this volume primitive material. And so you can see its color. I've mapped the density on it, and the drop-off is based on a cube. So this is what it looks like, the material for it. So if you just make a volume primitive in your scene and up the on the volume primitive, just make sure you turn on volume samples override. You'll see it's pretty straightforward to figure out what they do, and you can also experiment with it using IPR. So anyway, that's really what's going on, is that I'm experimenting in Photoshop while also messing around with volume primitives in these scenes. So now going back to Photoshop, the next thing had to do with making a decision in regards to the composition. And so let me close out this one. And I've got 23 here. So that's the one we were looking at 6K. And then I have this one, 23 test, where we can see on the swatch here, we have the same composition as far as the background, while in this one, the background actually changed. Let me let this open. It's a 1 gig PSD, so it'll take a couple seconds. All right, so now it's open. And so the big change that happens here is that the background has been flipped, and we've got some shadows being raked over the character. And so I actually had a friend over, and he asked him his opinion, just looking at the previous PSD. So looking at this one. Let's give this a couple of seconds to load. All right. So I had this one, and he's a VFX art director at a big studio, and just got his opinion. He does paint overs all day long, and so he looked at it, and one of the first things he said in like 2 minutes was like, "Why don't you flip the background horizontally?" Which at this point I'd just sort of gotten so used to the background being this way that it hadn't really crossed my mind, and so that was the first thing that he changed. So I just let him sit for 10 minutes with my PSD. So he flipped the background, and then, like we see here, and then made another layer and just threw some shadows on top of the character. And so he probably sat for like 10 minutes and made those suggestions. And while The PSD that he tweaked, which is the one we're looking at, I still felt was a little too dark for what I wanted. There were still, you know, two really good ideas that came out of having a fresh pair of eyes look at the image. And so, which is obviously why lots of people post works in progress on forums just to get other people's opinions. But, you know, having Jonathan take a look at my image and so quickly just say, flip the background, put some cast shadows on the guy, was something that I thought was kind of funny because it was two really cool ideas that came so quickly to him. But in the end, that was that. So everything else, as far as the lighting and stuff, you know, you can see he did some little paint marks in here, just suggesting there should be more uplighting. That if there is bright glows coming from the pits, obviously they need to affect the lighting on the walls inside here. He increased the saturation a little bit on the pit fog. But the main thing that I dug really was the idea of cast shadows on the character, because then it implies that there's something behind the camera that's casting a shadow onto the character. It brings us sort of further into the environment. And then the flipped background was a big deal because with my original composition, we were flattening things out. You know, once the background got flipped, all of a sudden, all of this stuff here creates a much greater depth of the scene. And things like these stairs and the depth going back there and the sky, all of that was being convoluted by the character. So this, in the end, this side of the image of the environment was more interesting than this side. But the character was blocking it. So it took me, you know, while I thought they were cool ideas, it obviously I didn't work on the image for a couple of days just to process whether I wanted to deal with, you know, flipping the environment, because I knew I'd have to flip it in 3D, which isn't a big deal, but that was going to take a little bit of time to flip everything and have it still work. But anyway, that gave me sort of a direction as far as changing the lighting on the character. So that was the next step is, okay, I'm going to flip the background in Maya, and I'm going to create some 3D lighting on the character with some cast shadows, and then try and finalize the fog effects in the environment so that we have you know, stronger pit glow and some more interesting fog. So that's what happened next. So everything we've been talking about so far in this chapter has just been that Photoshop and doing paint overs is a really useful way to explore directions that you can go in with your image, just because it goes a lot faster. And so again, the difference between here, at this point I was still sort of digging the image, but from here to here it just becomes much more dramatic. And so flipping the background, you can see, just adds more depth to the scene. The increased use of environment effects, so you can see that I still have black in the background back there. So here fog is reducing contrast as things get further away, so also adding the feeling of depth and scale. And then the cast shadows are just a little bit more dramatic for the character and make him feel integrated as opposed to composited, because in here in the end he is feeling a little bit composited. So I guess the next thing to move on then is to take a look at you know, the scene files where I start arriving at the final lighting or the final light rig for the environment and the character, and then arriving at the final settings for the environment effects, and how I decided to render out the different passes for that stuff for compositing. And so kind of once we're at a point where we've talked about final lighting, the environment effects, and compositing the final image, we can then get into some of the effects elements like the particles floating around or the locusts or the smoke and the fire and that. So let's move on to final lighting and fog effects and stuff.